It was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house at the other side of the wood, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know that there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch. Extraordinarily long arms. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud. And that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinarily long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, and back to Mr. Tickle. As you can see, it's very useful indeed, having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out of the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he thought to himself. So, later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeked in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle reached in through the window with that extraordinarily long arm of his, went up behind a little boy called Peter, and tickled him on the back of his neck. Peter giggled out loud. "Stop that giggling at once," said the teacher sternly. Mr. Tickle waited a minute, then reached in through the window again. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned round very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned, a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept on tickling, until soon the teacher was laughing out loud and saying, "Oh, stop it! Stop it! Oh, no, stop it!" over and over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought he'd had enough fun. So he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then very quietly brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about, which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. The policeman on traffic duty at the crossroads in the middle of the town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards, and the apples rolled all over the shop. There were apples everywhere. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And tickled him again. Until the train was 10 minutes late, and all the passengers were absolutely furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting in his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he'd tickled. Oh, dear. Oh, Mr. Funny lived in a teapot. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, and it suited Mr. Funny very nicely. One day, Mr. Funny was having lunch. He wasn't very hungry, so he only had a daisy sandwich and a glass of toast. Delicious, he murmured to himself as he finished his funny lunch. After lunch, Mr. Funny decided to go for a drive in his car. Mr. Funny's car was a shoe. Have you ever seen a car that looks like a shoe? It looks very funny. As he drove along, everybody who saw him laughed to see such a funny sight. He passed a worm at the side of the road. The worm thought Mr. Funny in his funny car was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He nearly laughed himself in two. He passed a pig in a field. The pig thought Mr. Funny in his funny car was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. She nearly laughed her tail off. Even the flowers he passed thought that Mr. Funny was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen. They nearly laughed themselves out of the ground. Eventually, Mr. Funny came to some crossroads. He didn't know which way to go, so he looked at the signpost. One of the signs said, "To the zoo." "Oh, that'd be fun," thought Mr. Funny to himself. So he drove his shoe towards the zoo. When he arrived at the gate of the zoo, he stopped. It was closed. "I'm sorry," said the zookeeper. "But we had to close the zoo because all the animals have a cold. And they're all feeling very sorry for themselves." "Oh, dear," said Mr. Funny. And then he thought. "Perhaps I could help to cheer them up," he said. "Well," said the zookeeper, "worth a try, I suppose." And he opened the gate. Mr. Funny drove into the zoo in his shoes. First thing he saw was an elephant. It was true. The elephant was feeling very sorry for herself. Very sorry indeed. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking elephant. And the sad-looking elephant stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh, dear. Then, do you know what Mr. Funny did? He pulled a funny face. Mr. Funny, as you can imagine, is very good at pulling funny faces. The elephant giggled. He'd never seen anything so funny. Mr. Funny pulled another funny face. And the elephant burst out laughing. The elephant laughed and laughed and laughed. Oh, she laughed so hard, she nearly laughed her trunk off. Oh, and she felt a lot better. Mr. Funny went over to the lion house. There was a lion, feeling extraordinarily sorry for himself. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking lion, and the sad-looking lion stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh, dear. And then Mr. Funny pulled the funniest-looking face that's probably ever been pulled anywhere, ever. Now, you've heard a lion roar before, haven't you? Well, this lion roared, too, with laughter. He laughed so hard, he did laughed his whiskers to pieces. And then Mr. Funny went round to see all the other animals in the zoo. Oh, dear, what a miserable-looking lot. For all of them, Mr. Funny pulled funnier and funnier faces. The big brown pig giggled, then burst out laughing, and the giraffe laughed so hard she nearly laughed her neck into a knot. And the hippopotamus nearly laughed himself out of his skin, and the penguins nearly laughed their flippers floppy. The leopard. Oh, you should have seen him. He laughed so hard, he nearly laughed his spots off. His spots off. Oh, what a pandemonium. Oh, Mr. Funny, giggled the zookeeper, who'd started laughing as well. Oh, Mr. Funny, thank you very, very much indeed, sir, for coming to cheer us up. Oh, nothing really, replied Mr. Funny modestly, and drove off in his shoe. Later, when Mr. Funny arrived home, he chuckled to himself. Well, he said, well, that's the end of another funny day. And he parked his shoe and went inside his teapot. And because he was feeling thirsty, he made himself a nice hot cup of cake.